Rome did not create an empire through bravery alone. It built it through debt. We like to picture Roman legions as fearless warriors driven by honor and discipline. But behind every shining helmet and sharpened sword stood an enormous and expensive system. Armies needed food, weapons, roads, and regular pay. Horses required feed. Siege engines demanded wood and labor. None of this was possible without money, vast amounts of it. So how did Rome afford centuries of conquest, and why does this still matter today? Because when you study Rome's war machine closely, a clear pattern emerges. War was not limited to the battlefield. It was embedded in the financial structure itself. And once that structure began moving, it had no brakes. Expansion was no longer optional. It became economically necessary. Sound familiar? In the early Republic, Rome's army was made up of landowning citizens. If you owned property, you could be called to fight. Soldiers supplied their own gear and expected to return home after the campaign. But as Rome expanded, wars grew longer and farther away. That system collapsed. You couldn't fight distant wars with part-time farmers. Rome needed professionals. And that's when military funding became centralized. The state began paying soldiers a wage, small, but enough to secure loyalty. Then came the turning point. Conquest itself became a source of income. Each new province delivered taxes, slaves, mines, and tribute. War began financing more war, a self-feeding cycle. But here's where it became dangerous. Rome didn't rely only on taxes, it relied heavily on borrowing. During long and costly conflicts like the Punic Wars against Carthage, the Republic took massive public loans from wealthy elites, especially Rome's rising financial class. These were not acts of patriotism. They were investments. And investors expected returns, interest payments, tax collection rights, and exclusive business privileges in newly conquered territories. War became a business, and the more profitable it became, the more Rome fought. Does that ring a bell? Over time, this war-driven economy reshaped society. Political power shifted toward generals who could promise loot. Senators became stakeholders in violence. Private contractors, the publicani, handled logistics, supply, and tax collection, extracting enormous profits along the way. It was military-industrial capitalism dressed in a toga. And the costs kept growing. To pay soldiers and creditors, the state needed constant new revenue. When expansion slowed or rebellions drained the treasury, Rome turned to an ancient solution, weakening its currency. Beginning under Emperor Nero, the silver content of the denarius was quietly reduced. Over the next 2 centuries, emperors repeated the process, transforming a trusted silver coin into a hollow promise. Inflation followed. Trust collapsed. By the 3rd century, Rome's monetary system was in free fall. Meanwhile, the wealthy protected themselves. Senators and elites stored value in land, slaves, and foreign holdings. Ordinary citizens paid taxes with debased money. Public services deteriorated. Corruption spread. And the financial burden of endless wars fell on the lower classes through inflation, forced labor, and conscription. This wasn't just a military breakdown, it was a monetary one. Now pause and look at the modern world. Governments running massive deficits, wars financed through borrowing, central banks quietly expanding the money supply to cover the gap, a financial class profiting from defense contracts and crises, an economy that must keep expanding, militarily, financially, or monetarily, just to survive. The comparison isn't perfect, but the resemblance is unsettling. Rome shows us that an economy built on expansion, especially violent expansion, eventually reaches its limit. There are only so many lands to seize, resources to extract, and enemies to fight. When expansion stops, the system turns inward. Debt remains, expectations remain, but income disappears. That's when the state squeezes its own people. Rome increased taxes, debased its currency further, and expanded control. Bread and circuses kept the population distracted while elites fortified their estates. Familiar? Today we don't call it tribute. We call it taxation, quantitative easing, or monetary policy. But the mechanics are strikingly similar. Central banks create money. Governments spend beyond their means. The wealthy accumulate assets. The poor struggle with shrinking purchasing power. Wars are still funded with debt. The United States spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, mostly borrowed. Who received the contracts? Who earned the interest? And who paid through inflation, reduced public services, and unstable currencies? You already know. Once debt becomes the default, money creation no longer requires emergencies. It becomes routine. The extraordinary becomes normal. And the longer it continues, the harder it is to stop until it breaks. That's why economic history matters. These aren't ancient stories. They are warnings. Rome outsourced power to private finance, became dependent on expansion, hollowed out its currency, and crushed its citizens under obligations the system could no longer sustain. Not because it was evil, but because it had no off switch. Today's empire looks different. It's digital, global, and powered by capital flows instead of legions. But the rules are the same. Money follows power. War remains profitable. Inflation punishes the weak. And financial illusions hold until they don't. So what can you do? Start by recognizing the pattern. Most people don't. They believe inflation is random, that debt equals freedom, that growth never ends. The Stoics had a word for this: illusion. You can't fully escape the system, but you can understand it. You can stop playing blindly. You can build resilience, not just financially, but mentally. That means studying financial history, not just personal finance. Watching for structural stress, not market noise. Asking a simple question: who benefits when I stay confused? You were never meant to ask how Rome paid for its wars, or how modern states do it today. You were meant to watch the spectacle, the headlines, the numbers, not the incentives, not the machinery. But now you see it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Financial education isn't just about saving or investing. It's about understanding power, systems, and the illusion of stability. So the next time you hear about a new conflict, stimulus package, or crisis, don't just watch. Follow the money. Ask who lends, who profits, and who pays. Because history teaches us one thing clearly: empires don't collapse when enemies break the gates. They collapse when the math stops working and no one dares to fix it.